Has Nostradamus really predicted everything? I'm the host. This is the Lie Detector Files, and we're going to answer this extraordinary question using evidence from some of the greatest minds in history. Let's dive right in. Our story begins in France during the Middle Ages. Born in 1401, Michel de Nostradame was a man ahead of his time. An astrologer and physician, he was the first of his kind to use a scientific method to make predictions about the future. He kept meticulous records of planetary positions and then used that data to inform his readings. His star charts were so accurate, in fact, that historians believe he may have actually invented the telescope. But Nostradamus wasn't just a scientist, he was also a mystic and a poet. In fact, he wrote over 6,000 lines of poetry. But here's where things get strange. Most of those poems contained coded messages about the future. Nostradamus allegedly had visions of great disasters that would befall humanity. He saw world wars and plagues and terrorist attacks. And so he decided to write them all down in a book called Les Prophecies. That brings us to the question, did Nostradamus predict every major disaster in history? To answer it, we'll break down some of his most famous quatrains, which is what he called his cryptic prophecies. We'll compare them directly to historical events, and we'll see if there are any matches. Along the way, we'll meet some of the people who believe Nostradamus was a misunderstood prophet and others who say he was just a master of vague guesses. You decide what you think. Let's start with the basics. Every Nostradamus quatrain follows this simple structure. There are 4 lines in each, but each line is made up of 3 rhyming couplets. That means there are 6 rhymes in every prophecy, and that's not a coincidence. It's a deliberate attempt to make the prophecies easier to remember. So while Nostradamus was writing these verses, he probably had no idea what exactly they would predict. Instead, he was trying to come up with memorable rhymes that could apply to almost anything. That's a big part of why Nostradamus has been so popular throughout history. People love to read his prophecies and think that he knew the future, but in reality, it is much more likely that he was just a gifted poet who happened to be interested in astronomy. Still, that doesn't mean Nostradamus didn't make any true predictions. Let's take a look at one of his most famous quatrains. This one has been attributed with predicting both World War I and World War II, so let's take a closer look. From the depth of the earth, fire and blood shall gush forth, all in a moment as it is fated. And the fortress of the high mountain shall fall with a mighty crash. When reading Nostradamus, it's important to keep 2 things in mind. First, he never gives an exact date for his predictions. He only gives approximate years. For example, in this quatrain, he says that the events will happen when Mars is in Aquarius. Well, that doesn't help us much because Mars spends about 7 months in Aquarius every year. Second, Nostradamus likes to use double meanings and puns. It's important to keep that in mind when trying to decipher his prophecies. So, what does this quatrain actually predict? Well, there are 2 possible interpretations. The first interpretation says that the fortress of the high mountain refers to a place in Jerusalem. In 1099, Crusaders attacked and captured Jerusalem. They built a fortress on top of the Temple Mount and held it for the next 80 years until 1187 when it was recaptured by Saladin. If we assume Nostradamus was talking about that fortress, then this quatrain predicted either the first siege of Jerusalem in 1099 or its recapture in 1187, but which one? Well, here's where things get interesting. The original French text says that the events will happen when Mars is in Aquarius. Mars is in Aquarius between January and March. In 1099, that meant the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. But in 1187, it was the beginning of the end. The Crusaders had already lost the battle. Maybe that's why Nostradamus's quatrains are so vague. He didn't want to give away the ending. Okay, time for a quick break. But before we go, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. It really helps out the channel. Also, you might want to consider following our updates page. We post fascinating historical tales every day. Okay, back to the show. Nostradamus is famous for allegedly predicting the French Revolution, but how accurate was he? Let's take a look at another one of his quatrains. In the days of Chima, when the young lions shall leap over the Alps, there shall be seen a comet in the sky, the great king of terror with a following of. We've reached the point where we need to discuss just how unreliable sources of Nostradamus' prophecies are. When you read online, you usually find four main versions of his work. The first version contains 942 couplets. This is the most widely available edition, and it's what most people think of when they hear Nostradamus' name. The second edition contains 6,227 couplets. This version is much less common, but it's still much shorter than the third version, which contains 30,000 couplets. Finally, there's the fourth edition, which contains over 80,000 couplets. And here's the crazy part: historians believe the last three editions were all written by Nostradamus' disciples. They simply copied their master's style and then filled in the blanks with their own predictions. So the second, third, and fourth editions are basically just fake Nostradamus. This leaves us with only 942 couplets that can truly be considered canonical. But wait, there's more! Of those 942 couplets, only 286 were published during Nostradamus' lifetime. The rest were published after he died. So which version should we be looking at? Well, unfortunately, it's complicated. Even experts can't agree. Some say we should only look at the 286 original couplets. Others say we should look at the 942 total couplets. And still others say we should look at the much larger later works. In the end, there is no right answer. It all comes down to personal preference. But I personally prefer to err on the side of caution. So, for the purposes of this episode, we'll only be looking at the 286 original couplets. But which ones? Well, since we're dealing with prophecy here, we'll need to rely on faith. According to tradition, the quatrains were compiled into books after Nostradamus' death and numbered in the 18th century. Since then, they've been assigned numbers from 1 to 100. Each quatrain is given to numbers. The first one tells us which book the quatrain is found in, and the second number tells us what quatrain it is within that book. So, if we want to look at quatrain number 10, we would go to book 1 and count the first 10 quatrains. That'll bring us to quatrain number 10. So, which one should we look at today? Well, how about number 53, a great famine there shall be upon the earth, so that people are driven to eat the flesh of their children. Already mothers shall sell their bracelets and rings, and necklaces to save their offspring and their bodies. This quatrain predicts a terrible famine, one so bad that people will resort to cannibalism. Does that sound like something that could happen in modern times? Well, actually it has. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, thousands of people face starvation every year. In 2017, the UN even reported cases of children being sold by their own parents for as little as $10. So did Nostradamus really predict the future? Well, maybe. But some scholars argue that this quatrain was actually describing a much older event. They point to a civil war in Israel around 1325 as evidence. During that conflict, there were reports of people eating human flesh and selling their children into slavery. So, which is it? A future prediction or an account of the past? Well, sadly, we may never know. Nostradamus is often credited with predicting the September 11th attacks, but is that really the case? Let's take a closer look at the supposed prediction. The moon in the full of night over the high mountain, a new sage with a lone face shall appear between two worlds. He shall announce that no abbess shall be honored, that no monks, no novices to learn. These two quatrains are often combined to form one longer prophecy. Many people believe that Nostradamus was referring to the Twin Towers when he mentioned two worlds, but if you think about it, that doesn't make much sense. At the time Nostradamus wrote these quatrains, the Americas had not yet been discovered. So how could he have been talking about two worlds? Instead, it is much more likely that Nostradamus was using the phrase two worlds to refer to Europe and Asia. In fact, there's a medieval map that shows exactly what he meant. This map, known as the Hereford Mappamundi, divides the world into three parts. One for Europe, one for Asia, and one for Africa. It was created around 1250, just a few decades before Nostradamus was born. So when he said between two worlds, he was probably talking about the border between Europe and Asia. But who was this mysterious seer? According to tradition, he was a Christian monk named Beda, but some scholars argue that Beda was just a code name for Nostradamus himself. After all, Nostradamus was a well-known critic of the church, and it makes sense that he would try to hide his identity when talking about such controversial topics. What about the moon in the full of night? Some believe this refers to the darkness that fell over New York City on September 11th, but that is a bit of a stretch. A full moon just happens to be the brightest phase of the moon, and full of night just means full. So if Nostradamus was trying to hide his identity, why did he bother predicting the September 11th attacks? Well, he may have thought that no one would believe him anyway. According to legend, Nostradamus tried to warn the French king about the coming disaster, but the king didn't listen. So Nostradamus decided to write about it instead. Some scholars dismiss Nostradamus's predictions as nothing more than vague guesses. They say that he was a poet, not a prophet, and that his prophecies were nothing more than clever guesses that could apply to almost anything. So are Nostradamus's predictions true, or are they just lucky guesses? Well, sadly, we may never know, but that won't stop us from trying. After all, this is the Lie Detector Files. Thanks for watching. Do you think Nostradamus is a misunderstood prophet? Or just a master of vague guesses? Share your thoughts below.